Hey guys and girls. Today we're going to cover the Chapter 17, Section 4 Notes on Immigration. This section is going to cover three key concepts, 621A, B, and C. So let's get right to it. As key concept A says, as cities became areas of economic growth, featuring new factories and businesses, they attracted immigrants from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many migrants moved to escape poverty, religious persecution, and limited opportunities for social mobility in their homes, countries, or regions. B, urban neighborhoods based on particular ethnicities, races, and classes provided new cultural opportunities for city dwellers. And C, increasing public debates over assimilation and Americanization accompanied the growth of international migration. Many immigrants negotiated compromise between the cultures they brought and the cultures they found in the United States. So I broke the notes into two parts. The first part, we're going to look at the push factors that pushed immigrants from Russia and Eastern European descent, particularly Jewish people, out. We'll look at Southern Italians, and then Asia with the Chinese and Japanese. So let's start there in Russia and Eastern Europe with Jewish people. Many Jewish people wanted to escape Russia due to the pogroms, which were a violent riot where the Russian government under the Tsar rounded up Jewish people and forced them to settle on what's called the Pale of Settlement, which is in the western region of Imperial Russia. So they were rounded up and forced to live in these Jewish ghettos in what's called the Pale of Settlement. This resulted in a large number of Jews escaping this persecution by moving to the United States. Just a little bit more background on why Russia did this. The Tsar monarchy basically made the Jews the scapegoats for Russia's problems at the time in order of self-preservation. You have to remember Russia's monarchy at the time is on the decline. We're only a couple decades away from the 1917 Russian Revolution, which overthrows the Tsar and, of course, begins the Soviet Union under the communists and the Bolsheviks. Next, we have the Southern Italians. So between 1880 and 1914, some 4 million Italian immigrants came to the United States to escape poverty and violence. So a little background from world history. If you guys remember, after unification in Italy in 1871, the wealth and industry of Italy was concentrated in the north, while the south was basically rural farmland, but was also a land of poverty. Part of the problem was that farmland was very poor for growing crops, agriculture. To make matters worse, in Italy in 1906, Mount Vesuvius, the famous volcano that erupted and destroyed Pompeii of ancient Roman times, erupted. This destroyed a lot of towns and destroyed a lot of the good, rich, grape-growing farmland that did remain in southern Italy. So you combine those two factors and you get a huge influx of Southern Italians into the United States between 1880 and 1914. Lastly, we have immigrants from China and Japan. So in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. Despite this, some Chinese were still allowed to migrate. Basically, they needed to prove that they had relatives living in the United States, and then the U.S. government would allow them to come. But the Chinese Exclusion Act did limit Chinese migration. Then we have Japan. Japanese immigration would still make its way into the U.S. Most Japanese immigrants came in search of opportunity, often hearing stories of other Japanese immigrants who found success in Hawaii and California. So that's mainly where Japanese immigrants settled. But just a little hint to what we'll talk about later on, there will be some major problems with Japanese immigration and their treatment by the U.S. government, especially in states like California. That's going to start increasing the tensions between Japan and the United States, which will culminate with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and World War II. But this is really kind of the beginning of decades of tension between our nation and Japan. All right, our second part of the notes is jobs, cities, and Americanization. So on the East Coast, the process of immigrants took place at Ellis Island. It proved to be both intrusive and in many cases Americanizing. For example, many names were often changed to sound more American. For example, if you were a German immigrant with the last name Schmidt, A lot of times it would be changed to Smith. Same thing happened on the West Coast. That was obviously dealt with more Asian immigrants, but Angel Island became the processing center in San Francisco, the equivalent to Ellis Island in New York. One other thing I want to mention about this is we often think of this time as a melting pot. In a way, we are a nation of immigrants. There's no denying that, but the notion that America became a melting pot specifically during this decade, arguably this would be decades later, is a misnomer. Most of these newcomers came to reside in their own communities, whether it was in cities or not, continued to speak their native tongues, and practice their same cultural customs that they did in their homeland. So this idea of a melting pot that we kind of correlate with this time period of Ellis and Angel Island actually is a misnomer. It's really later in the 20th century where finally you have this embrace of, or mix of cultures. Early on in this time period, mainly continue to speak their native tongue, practice their own customs, live together. A good example of that would be the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That's where a very strong Jewish presence began. Many found work in the garment industry, for example, and we'll talk about later on about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and what happened to a lot of Eastern European women in that fire. With the establishment of standard sizes for clothing during the Civil War, this allowed for mass production instead of individualized clothing, which further led to the development of larger factories known as sweatshops. And that's the image from a TV show Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where Charlie and Dee are working in Frank's sweatshop. If you never saw the show, it's funny. Anyway, you have the same thing with Italians, creating their own ethnic communities in cities such as New York, Chicago, Boston, Milwaukee, more east, definitely East Coast, though. New York City definitely being the big hub of Italian immigration. Another group of immigrants we didn't talk too much about, it's not really new, but you have more and more Mexican migrants arriving during the Industrial Revolution. These Mexican communities became known as barrios, where Mexican traditions, food, and Catholic religion were prominent. So with this huge influx of Mexican and Italian migrants, the Catholic religion is going to practically double in size from the time of the Civil War to 1900, as it served both native and foreign-born Americans. But the Chinese, they also began the tradition in America that featured the establishment of laundries, or we refer to them laundromats today. And the Japanese, as we talked about, mainly settled in Hawaii and California. What many of them ended up doing was working on sugar cane plantations in Hawaii. And then, of course, is a picture of Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, which features Emma Lazarus' poem, The New Colossus. If you've never read it, recommend it. If you've ever been there, I also recommend taking a short visit at some point. All right, so that's a wrap on the Section 4 notes. I will see you guys next week, and we'll continue with the new chapter.